There is a huge shift happening right now in lumber markets that will impact lumber supplies and prices for years to come. So let's talk about it. Like a lot of commodities, the lumber industry is a boom and bust business. When things are good and there's a lot of building going on, the industry expands. More trees are cut, new mills are built, and there are plenty of jobs to go around. When things are tough, however, entire cities and towns can get wiped out entirely. Things are tough right now, and we're seeing a downturn in lumber markets and a shift away from traditional lumber powerhouses in Canada and the Northwest to a new center in the Southeast. But how did we get to a place where there's such a huge shift, and what is really behind it? Is it going to last, and how will this impact lumber quality, lumber markets, and lumber prices in the future? Well, to really understand what's going on, we need to go back to the 1980s and 90s, back when the lumber industry was also going through another time of monumental shifts and changes. Back then, timber suppliers were being restricted, and there was more international competition due to globalization. Added to that, there was also a recession, which resulted in less building in the US generally, as you can see from this graph of new housing units under construction during that time. That reduced building caused the demand for lumber to decrease because over 90% of the homes in the US are built out of wood, and a huge portion of the demand for lumber comes from single-family home construction or remodeling. That recession and demand decline impacted the lumber industry in the Pacific Northwest in particular, because that is where most lumber was being harvested at the time. But lumber wasn't the only industry that was struggling at that time. There was also a farm crisis in the 1980s, which sent farm commodity prices dropping, and it drove scores of farmers and farmer families out of business. This also depressed rural economies and had a ripple effect throughout the country. All of this prompted the Reagan administration to sign the Farm Bill of 1985.
Thank you all for the Herculean effort you put forth on behalf of America's farmers. The plight of so many of our farmers has been a major concern of this administration and of responsible members of Congress on both sides of the aisle.
Now, there was a lot in that Farm Bill, but one of the provisions was called the Conservation Reserve Program, or the CRP, which was a subsidy program in which farmers were paid to convert farmland into wild grasslands or timberlands. The idea was that because a lot of the farm crisis was caused by surpluses, if you reduce the amount of farmland overall, it would bring supply back in line with demand and stabilize prices. It was originally meant to be a short-term program, and it was designed to reset some farmland, add more natural landscapes, and add trees, which would not only help the environment, but also lead to a larger supply of timber in the future. And even though it was originally designed to be a short-term program, it's actually still in place today. And since the program was put into place, around 22.6 million acres have been converted from farmland into timberland, and over $50 billion have been paid out to landowners since 1986. And as a side note, the people who benefited from those payouts and continue to benefit from those payouts tend to be already wealthy landowners. Just one more example of how it pays to be rich. One of the lasting impacts of the CRP was that the southern US became a powerhouse of lumber production because of all of the trees that were planted since the CRP was introduced. And today, there are lumber mills being opened and expanded all over the US South, at a time when lumber mills in the Pacific Northwest and in Canada are being shut down. In fact, you can see here sometime in the 2010s when the southern US overtook the rest of the US in lumber production. Now, this isn't the first time that the US South was a powerhouse for lumber production. When the first European settlers came to what would become the United States, there were vast forests and trees that covered most of the South. Many of those trees were cut and used in constructing cities and in shipbuilding, but in a lot of other cases, many other cases in fact, the trees were actually burned in order to clear more land for farming. And farming in the South has been a huge industry ever since. But that's why the CRP was so revolutionary to timber production in the southern US. Vast tracts of land, which had been farmed for a couple of generations, were planted with trees starting in the 1980s and 1990s. Those trees have had 20 to 30 plus years to mature. And so today there are huge supplies of timber in the South ready to be cut. So much so that the US is now poised to overtake Canada as the largest lumber producing region in North America. All while this is going on, there's also other things going on in Canada. Canadian lumber has been under pressure for a number of years now. Part of the reason for that is due to US tariffs on Canadian lumber, which are only likely to increase under the new Trump administration.
The word tariff, properly used, is a beautiful word. One of the most beautiful words I've ever heard. It's music to my ears.
There have also been huge fires in Canada that have caused widespread destruction of forest resources. And then there are other environmental factors such as beetle infestations that are killing vast swaths of trees. Then there's also the Canadian government that's placed more and more restrictions and regulations on Canadian lumber companies and made it more difficult to get the timber supplies that they need to actually make lumber. All of this is making Canadian lumber less and less profitable and less competitive, and coupled with the reduced demand for lumber that we're currently experiencing, many lumber mills in Canada are closing their doors.
Canfor has announced it is closing down sawmills in Vanderhoof and Fort St. John. The closures come less than 4 months after Canfor permanently shut down a mill in Bear Lake, curtailed production at a Prince George mill, and a suspended planned investment.
The Pacific Northwest has also experienced many of the same problems as Canadian lumber, minus the tariffs, of course, which wouldn't apply. And lumber production in that region has been slowly declining ever since the 1970s. There are a few other reasons why the Southeast U.S. is more desirable for lumber companies than the Pacific Northwest. And one of those is that there aren't the same environmental protections in place that limit logging there. There's no spotted owl, no marbled murrelet. Also, the tree species that are usually grown in the South, like the southern yellow pine, grow faster, which means less time between harvests. And it generally costs less for lumber mills to buy those logs, in part because there's so many at the moment. So all of these factors taken together actually make softwood lumber coming from the southern US less expensive to produce after, of course, the large initial investments of mills and other things like that are made. So that is the huge shift that we're seeing right now. The southern US is becoming one of the largest lumber producing regions in North America and by extension, the world. And it's about to overtake Canada in terms of softwood lumber capacity, and that's significant. Here's one of the most interesting aspects of all this, though, in my opinion. And that is that one of the main drivers of lumber production in this region is coming from Canadian lumber companies. That's right, Canadian lumber companies have been buying up US lumber mills and US timberland, especially in the South, for years, mainly in an effort to avoid tariffs on Canadian lumber, because if the Canadian lumber companies actually harvest and process that lumber in the US, the tariffs don't apply. So in one respect, the boom of timber harvests in the South can still benefit Canada, although not everyday Canadians that may be working in mills because they're losing their jobs. But it does benefit the Canadian lumber companies that operate within the US. So what does this mean for all of us, the American consumer of lumber? Well, generally it's a good thing from a cost perspective, and that is because it's generally cheaper to produce lumber in the South than it is in the Pacific Northwest or Canada. It is a negative in terms of lumber quality, though. Logs from the Pacific Northwest and from Canada tend to be of a higher quality than logs from the Southeast. This is actually one of the main reasons why lumber today is so terrible. In fact, I made a great video on this topic a while back, and so you should check that out. If you're interested, I'll leave a link for you to click on that, plus there'll be a pop-up here as well. Here's the thing though, there is a finite amount of lumber capacity in the US South. So this graph here can't go up forever. Now, if they practice sustainable forestry, they can maintain a supply indefinitely, but not at extremely high levels. There is a point where the capacity levels off just because there's only so much land and only so many trees. Canada, however, has vast untapped timber resources, and even though production in places like British Columbia has slowed down, other parts of Canada have near limitless supplies of softwood timber. The only problem is that in a lot of these areas, there isn't the right amount of infrastructure to get them out, making the harvesting of timber from those lands prohibitively expensive, especially in light of other issues that we've already talked about. If, however, we see lumber demand pick up because of more building in the US, that could all change. So what do you guys think? Do you live in areas of the South where timber harvesting has picked up over the past few years? Please share your experiences on what you've seen, good or bad. Or perhaps you live in the Pacific Northwest and you've seen the decline there. I'd love to read about what you have to say, so please leave me a comment. As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to my channel, and check out one of these other awesome videos, and I'll see you in the next one.